Maybe you're watching this before midterms, maybe you're watching it before finals, but chances are you've got a paper or presentation coming up. Today, I'm going to talk you through a paper and presentation workshop to help you ace those writing and speaking assignments that you have coming up. My goal is to help you organize your papers and presentations, and that organization falls into three buckets. We have our introduction, our body section, and our conclusion. Let's get started with the introduction. Effective introductions have three parts: a hook, a thesis statement, and a preview of main points. The hook should always come first. You want to capture the audience's attention right off the bat. You can do that in a variety of different ways. For example, you could tell a story or refer to a recent current event, share a fact or statistic. You could show a surprising photograph. You could tell a quote. You want to consider when you're picking what you use as your hook, your audience. Who are you speaking with and what might be able to draw them in? You also might want to think about what tone are you trying to establish with this presentation. If you're trying to entertain while informing, you might want to consider something maybe funny. If you have a serious, persuasive presentation, picking a serious attention grabber makes a lot of sense. There is a common one that a lot of students use, and that is envisioning a hypothetical situation. So, what if one day you started a new job at a new organization with no friends, and your boss came up to you and said, ... Those kind of what if scenarios can be useful, but I would caution you to use them as kind of a last resort and think about how you can use more strategic approaches to hooking your audience's attention. The thesis statement is the most important part of the introduction, and the thesis statement refines the purpose of the paper or presentation. It captures everything that the audience will be learning about into one central idea and foreshadows what the main points of the paper or presentation will be. There are a lot of requirements of a thesis statement that are listed below, but the most important are that it's expressed as a full declarative statement, one sentence that is structured concisely and previews the key issues that will be discussed in the paper or presentation. Again, limit that thesis statement to one idea and try to use very specific language as you do so. And finally, the very last part of your introduction is the preview of main points, which provides a framework for the rest of the paper or presentation and lets the audience know what they can expect. So this helps the audience follow along and kind of get their wits about them on what you're going to be talking to them or writing to them about. And we want this to be very explicit. And I don't mean swear words explicit. I mean direct and clear about what we will accomplish. So I will explain X, Y, and Z. Or first, I'll describe the problem. Second, I offer a solution. And third, I justify the budget. When we are very obvious for the audience, it cues them up right from the beginning to know that the rest of our presentation will be very well structured too. There are a few other things to consider including in your introduction depending on the type of presentation that you're giving and how much time that you have or your paper. So first is a relevance statement, and this shows the relationship between the topic and the audience. It basically tells the audience why they should care about what you're presenting about or writing about, and kind of indicates their what's in it for me or the so what of the presentation or paper. You also might need to define some key terms. So think about, am I using jargon that my audience might not understand? If so, define that key term for them. Or if you're using a word in a particular way that might be different than what the audience understands it. So if they have a different connotation with a word, you might want to define for them how you define the word. And finally, you can have a credibility statement. So that helps demonstrate your trustworthiness or your believability. And often it highlights your expertise in a given topic. Maybe that is with regard to your education or experiences that you've had in your life. And it also answers the question, what relationship do I as the speaker or writer have with this topic? And why should the audience listen to me in particular more than anyone else or alongside other folks as they are learning about this topic? After we've provided a strong introduction for our paper or presentation, Then we move to the body section, which is what provides the substance of our paper or presentation. And with our body sections, it's really important that we have structure and organization across 3 different levels, those being the body, the paragraph or the main point, and the sentence. The body of our paper and paragraphs, or our presentation and main points, should be well structured. So with regard to the paper or paragraph, we should have our introduction first, a given set of main points or paragraphs, and then our conclusion. In the same way, our paragraphs or our main points should have a topic sentence, and then supporting sentences or supporting points, which are often explanations and definitions or elaborations and examples. And then we have our concluding sentence that wraps up and transitions to our next point. When we're structuring the body of our presentation or paper, we want to think very critically about how we're presenting our main points or our paragraphs, what order we're presenting them in, and what the focus of them are in order to make sure that the audience can follow along with our organizational structure. We already talked about informational organizational patterns in class, so I'll give you time to pause the video here and review some options that you have for informational organizational patterns. We also discussed persuasive organizational patterns. Now there are some patterns that can be used for informational and persuasive presentations, but on the bottom of the screen you'll see there are some that are pretty much just for persuasion. So take a pause here and review some of your options for informational and persuasive strategies. Transitions, as we discussed previously, are really important for helping the audience follow along. We can use previews, verbal transitions, nonverbal transitions, and summaries. One that's not listed here, though, is a directional transition. And a directional transition takes your audience from one point to the other. I like to think of it as crossing a bridge from one patch of grass to the next. So you say something like, now that we've talked about point A, we're going to turn and talk about point B. So that direction, we're saying now that we're done with this, we're moving to that. Directional transitions. And then the ever useful signposts. Signposts kind of cue your audience up to where you are in the presentation and what they can expect to come next. There are a variety of transitions listed here that we've talked about in class, but I'll give you time to pause here and review them. All right, now that you've picked an organizational pattern for the structure of your body in your presentation or paper, we need to think about how we're going to structure our paragraphs. And paragraphs, again, each should have a coherent argument. In other words, it should be focused on a single idea whenever possible. We want to try to incorporate verbal bridges in our paragraphs. So those are things like repeating key words. We experienced a conflict. Conflict is when. We discussed our personality conflict, planned to avoid task conflict, and forgot about style conflict. So you're repeating conflict so the audience knows we're talking about conflict here in a variety of different ways. We also want to be really careful when we use pronouns. For example, we experienced conflict and groupthink. It caused major problems. Well, here in that sentence, we don't know what the it is. Was it the conflict, or the groupthink, or the combination of the two? We also want to think about using transition words to show order, relationships, and logic. And you can go back to those signposts that we talked about for more options. But for example, you might say, I think you should buy this product for 3 reasons. 1, 2, and 3. First, second, third. Or you can make a statement and say thus, or however, or in addition, or any other of those signpost words that we talked about earlier. Also want to be really careful to use parallel structure, especially when you're using lists. Parallel structure is when groups of words are following the same structure or pattern or verb tense. For example, we experienced groupthink, cohesion, and an ironic moment. So groupthink and cohesion are plural type nouns. And an ironic moment is a single ironic moment. So you might phrase it to be more parallel by saying, we experienced confusion and irony. Doesn't that sound a lot smoother? Another example is we worked quickly, accurately, and enjoyed ourselves. Well, quickly and accurately, those are describing how you worked, and enjoyed ourselves is describing how you felt. So instead, if you want to just be describing how you worked, we would say something like, we worked quickly, accurately, and enjoyably. That being parallel structure, they sound more consistent to the ear and they read more consistently. Each paragraph should demonstrate that you really thought about the content that is most important to be presented and how you're presenting it to the audience. So we have our topic sentence or our main point and our concluding sentence or our kind of wrap-up point. And in the middle, you have three either supporting sentences or main points. An example of how you could structure a paragraph would be to make a claim. After you've made that claim, define one of the key terms in that claim that your audience might not be familiar with or familiar with how you're understanding it. Then you can show your evidence as for why the claim is true. Maybe cite an outside source or tell a personal story and explain how that claim impacted a group or impacted the world or impacted you. And then finally reiterate your claim and transition or summarize as you move to the next point. Here's an example of how that last paragraph might look. You want to be firm in your topic sentence or your main point. Dr. Benedict was a Democratic leader. Then define what exactly is a Democratic leader. Democratic leadership is blank. It's really useful to use our own words when we're describing things like that rather than just citing word for word another person who said it, because saying it in our own words builds our credibility, especially if we paraphrase what someone else said. Cite them, but use our own words. Then, if you're to believe that Dr. Benedict was a Democratic leader, you would want to see some evidence of that. She did this thing and that thing that demonstrated she was a Democratic leader. Finally, okay, she's a Democratic leader, so why does that matter? Having a Democratic leader allowed blank or permitted the class to do this. Finally, Dr. Benedict engaged in democratic leadership. That is summarizing the paragraph or the main point that you just heard, but not everyone wanted to participate. That is transitioning us to the next main point, which might be about some of the problems that democracy had. Now that we've thought about how we want our main points to be structured, and we've thought about how our paragraph should be structured, we need to structure the sentences that are in that main point. So there are two kind of key parts of a sentence that I want to talk to you all about today, and those are the independent and the dependent clauses. So a clause is a group of words that has both a subject and a verb. So the subject is the who or the what is doing or being something. That's the person, the topic, the whatever, the subject of the sentence. The verb is what that subject is doing or being. So what's happening, what is the action of that sentence? So an independent clause is a complete thought. It could be a sentence. It stands independently on its own. So she is kind, she is smart, she is important. She is the subject and is the verb. A dependent clause is not a complete thought. It could not be a complete sentence, but it still does have a subject and a verb. For example, while she is kind, ... even though she is smart, ... since she is important, ... So there we have she is still our subject and verb is, but we don't know what is actually happening, We don't have the last part of the sentence that makes it a complete sentence. So in hearing dependent clauses, we can listen for these marker words, which are listed at the bottom, like after and although, before and even, though and unless, that cue us up to know that, hey, that can't be a complete sentence on its own. With regard to our clauses, there are 3 errors that we can make in our sentences. The first and one of the most common is a comma splice. And a comma splice is when you're splicing two sentences together that could stand alone with just a comma. So you're connecting two independent clauses with just a comma, and that comma isn't strong enough. For example, I have speaking anxiety, comma. It is because of my low self-confidence. I is the subject, have is the verb in the first independent clause. And in the second independent clause, it is the subject and is the verb. Those are two, they can stand alone. We need something stronger than a comma. So the first way of fixing this is that we could make the comma a period. So I have speaking anxiety, period. It is because of my low self-confidence. Now those two independent clauses are standing alone by themselves as they should. Another option is to use a semicolon if and only if the sentences are very closely related. So for example, you could say, I have speaking anxiety, semicolon, it is because of my low self-confidence. Because those sentences are pretty closely related, you wouldn't want to say something like, I have speaking anxiety. My friends laugh at me because I get nervous. It's not, those are kind of two totally different related ideas that you wouldn't want to smush together with a semicolon. You could also think about adding a dependent marker word, those that we talked about on the last slide. So I have speaking anxiety because of my low self-confidence. So we put in a dependent marker verb and we removed the it, the subject, to make it all one complete sentence. The second error that we can make is a fused sentence, often known as a run-on. That is when we smush together two independent clauses. So two kind of sentences that could stand on their own, but we smush them together without even bothering to use punctuation. For example, I have speaking anxiety. It is because of my low self-confidence. That's the same example as on the last slide, but without the comma. This time we just smushed them together. So we can use the same fixes, make the comma a period, use a semicolon if the sentences are very closely related, or add a dependent marker word. The third and final error that I want to talk to you all about today is the sentence fragment. The last two had to do with independent clauses, and this has to do with a dependent clause, or an incomplete thought. So a sentence fragment is when we treat a dependent clause or an incomplete thought as a complete sentence. So an example of this is I have speaking anxiety. I and have are our subject and our verb. That's a fine sentence. But because of my low self-confidence, that's not a complete sentence. That's an incomplete thought. It can't stand by itself because it doesn't have a subject and a verb. We have a subject, maybe, my low self-confidence, and we have a dependent marker verb, but we don't know for sure what the subject and the verb are. Other examples are, my face shows my anxiety, so my face is the subject, shows is the verb. That's a perfectly fine sentence. For example, comma, flushed cheeks and sweaty brows. Flushed cheeks and sweaty brows, those are a description. Those aren't really a subject or a verb. I mean, they could be a subject, but we don't have a verb to cue us to let us know that they're the subject. When there are strangers in the room making me anxious. Well, when, that's another of our dependent marker words. There are strangers, so are could be our verb, but this seems more like it's a description of the subject and the verb. So when there are strangers in the room making me anxious, I don't want to speak. That seems like it would be more of a complete sentence. So we have a couple of options for fixing our sentence fragments. We can combine it with another sentence to make it a complete thought. So my face shows my anxiety through my flushed cheeks and sweaty brows. Or I have speaking anxiety because of my low self-confidence. We can also remove the dependent marker word, and then the sentence can stand by itself with a subject and a verb. So there are strangers in the room making me anxious, instead of when there are strangers in the room making me anxious, ... Or I have speaking anxiety and low self-confidence. The moral of the story with this little lesson on structuring sentences is is always think about having a subject and a verb in your sentence. And also, am I trying to smush together too many subjects and verbs without punctuation, so a few sentences, or with punctuation that's not strong enough, a comma splice? We crushed our body section, our paragraphs, and our sentences. And now we have the conclusion. Last but certainly not least, the conclusion provides closure for our paper or our presentation. When you're crafting your conclusion, consider accomplishing these tasks. First, we want to transition to the close. This is particularly important when we're giving a presentation, so we can catch the audience's ear and let them know, hey, we're wrapping up. We can say things like, in conclusion, or to summarize, or in wrapping things up. Then, very, very importantly, we want to restate our thesis statement. What was the purpose of our presentation? What was the central idea or arguments that we made? We also want to review our main points. The more times the audience hears our main points or reads our main points, the more likely those main points are to stay with them after the presentation or the paper as the residual message. So you can switch the order of your thesis statement and main points, whatever flows best with your topic, but having those two things will make for a very strong conclusion. But if you want to add the icing on the cake for your conclusion, consider offering a memorable close or a clincher. This is when you're leaving the audience with something to think about. We could refer back to the hook. So if you told a story at the beginning of your presentation or paper, you could finish up the story at the very end and tell the audience about the short-term or long-term resolution. You could also offer a call to action and encourage the audience to do something or emphasize the importance of what you talked about today. Maybe you refer back to your statement at the beginning of the presentation that told the audience why they should pay attention to you in the first place. So having that kind of memorable close or clincher, it provides closure, and I like to say it ties your presentation or your paper off with a bow and sends your audience off on a positive note. There are a couple of pitfalls for conclusions, and the biggest one is introducing new arguments or points. So we don't want to all of a sudden bring up a topic that the audience hasn't heard anything about throughout our presentation. That's going to throw them off and make them think that there's more coming, or you're going to not have a complete argument or thought at the very end. We also want to be very, very careful about the length of our conclusion. We don't want to just quickly wrap it up and stop, but we don't want to also draw it out forever and ever and ever. I want to try to find that sweet spot. Usually about 3 to 5 sentences. You've got your signal to the close, preview of main points, and your thesis statement. Those all can happen in 2 sentences usually, and then 1 sentence or a few more for your closure. Throughout your paper or presentation, you might have been citing sources if you were drawing on outside material. You don't want to wait till the very end of your paper or presentation to say, and here are the sources that I cited. That's not the best. Right after you talk about a source, make sure you provide a good oral or written citation, and then at the very end of your presentation or paper, you can offer a references list if someone wants to consult your sources further. But that's a topic for another time, a different lecture. I'm sure you're all exhausted by now, learning about how to structure a 5-paragraph essay or a 5-point presentation. I just want to summarize. Today we talked about structuring those papers and presentations. We talked about introductions, where you hook the audience's attention. You provide a thesis statement and you preview your main points. You also might consider giving a relevant statement or a credibility statement or defining key terms in your introduction too. Then you've got your body section. You have your paragraphs or main points following a clear organizational structure. Within your paragraphs and key points, you have a topic sentence or a topic statement and your supporting evidence and a sentence that kind of summarizes and transitions to the next point. And within your sentences, you have an independent clause which has a verb and a subject. in your sentence. And finally, then you have your conclusion where you signal to the audience that you're wrapping up. Then you have your review of main points and your restatement of your thesis, and a clincher or a memorable close that ties a pretty little bow on the top of your presentation or paper. That's all I've got for you today. If you still need more information about creating papers and presentations, which you might, because this is a quick overview, even though it was more than 20 minutes, you can consult the Purdue OWL, and I'm not saying that just because I went there. It's a really good resource for writing and speaking. Otherwise, you can look for other .edu sites that come from universities and professors and schools and teachers that are just trying to help you learn how to write better and speak better. Thanks for listening, and we'll see you next time.